that the drama that comes with homecoming. I want to tell you just a quick story about a homecoming that I was a part of a long time ago when I was in high school. I'm not that old, but it seems like a long time ago. It was a dramatic story, and it was something that, well, it didn't go so well for me. I had the hots for this girl named Brianna. She was in choir, and actually her mom was the accompanist for our choir, so I practiced with her. I sang solos with Brianna's mom. This kind of small music room where we would practice some solos together. So I actually know Brianna's mom better than I knew Brianna. But I was anxious to ask Brianna out to the homecoming dance in Appleton, Wisconsin. And so I drove my mom's baby blue minivan because that was the car that we drove. That I drove in high school, the baby blue minivan. I drove this baby blue minivan to the Cops grocery store, and I went to the flower counter and I got a vase with 2 flowers in it. I mean, how cool is that? I got a vase with 2 flowers in it. Brianna's house was on the way back home, so I pulled into Brianna's driveway, and my heart is just like, it's just pounding because I'm like, Brianna, she knew who I was, but we weren't like friends, I knew her mom probably better than I knew her, and I had no idea what she was going to say, right? So I get to the door, and I'm carrying this vase with 2 flowers in it because that was all I could afford. I was a high school student, right? Got to the front door, knocked on the front door, and Brianna's mom answered the door. And I was like, she knew what I was doing. I had this vase in my hand, She knew what I was doing, but I went and I knocked on the front door. Her mom answered, and I said, "Is Brianna here?" And she said, "No." I said, "Well, I'm wanting to ask her to the homecoming date." And I could tell right away that this wasn't going to go well because Brianna's mom's face just kind of fell. And she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. She's already been asked by somebody else." Do you think that I enjoyed that homecoming dance at all? I went with somebody else. I couldn't tell you whose name it was that I went with. I went with somebody else. But the whole time that I was at that homecoming dance, homecoming dance is supposed to be fun, but I couldn't celebrate. I couldn't enjoy that dance. The whole time I was looking over my shoulder at Brianna and at my buddy who had beat me to the punch of asking her to the dance. I was so focused on what they were doing that I couldn't enjoy it at all. My homecoming was far too filled with drama. So too, this homecoming, this story from Luke 15 is so filled with drama. Let me give you just a very quick recap of this story, right? You've heard it before. Man has 2 sons. The younger son comes to his dad and says to him, "Dad, I wish you were dead." That's what he's saying. "I wish you were dead. I want a share of the inheritance that's coming to me." And without really debating this amongst himself, he says, "Okay, here is your portion of the inheritance. Here's half of my life I will give to you." The younger son, he goes quickly to another country. I'm going to call it Nebraska. Faraway place, right? A faraway place he goes to. Ed's not here, so I can say that. And he squanders this money, this property, this inheritance that has been given to him, right? And then there's a famine. And then he begins to be in need. And as a young Jewish boy, he goes to the pig farm. Jewish boys would not associate with pigs. There was an unclean animal. It was something that they would not do. He goes to the pig farm and he says, "Can I at least feed the pigs these pods that are on the ground?" And as he's feeding these pigs, these pods that are on the ground, he comes to himself and he starts debating amongst himself and he starts working up this speech and he says, "I should at least go back to my homeland. I should at least go back to where I came from, back to my father's house, and at least ask if I can be a hired hand." Takes this long way back, and he keeps rehearsing this speech. "Father, I shouldn't get heaven before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." He goes, and as he is still a long ways off, his dad is waiting at the end of the driveway for him. His dad is looking for him. His dad is hoping that he will come home. And as his dad sees him come around the corner, he hikes up his robe somebody who would not be expected to run. He runs out to his son. He falls on him and he embraces him. He kisses him. A kiss is a kiss to forgive sin. Forgives him of his sins in that kiss and says, quick, go get the ring. The ring meant sonship. Quick, go get, or meant authority, kind of power of attorney these days. And he says, quick, go and get sandals. Sandals were for children of the father. Slaves didn't wear sandals. He says, go and get the robe, not just any robe, but the best robe. And then he says, kill the fatted calf. We're going to have a barbecue. We're going to have a party. But what's actually happening? What is actually happening in this story? This story is often called the parable of the lost son, or the story of the prodigal. The prodigal just simply means wasteful. We have this story about a guy who takes his life, who spends all of his money, all of his father's inheritance on crazy living, and he comes home and he has this huge party thrown for him. But there's this other picture, this picture of another son who has never left home. This other son who seems to be equally lost and equally alone, but he refuses to be at home. This one who never has left home, he refuses to come into the home. And I wonder if maybe this story is more subtle than the wild wanderings of the younger son. Maybe that story isn't the story after all. Maybe Jesus is trying to help us to understand something bigger. Something bigger than don't run away from home. If you do run away from home, you can always come home and there will be a party. Maybe the actual story is the story about this older brother. The older brother who had all the exterior features, all of the outward signs of getting everything right. He did everything he was supposed to do. He worked hard. He worked the field. Everybody saw that he was a whatever older brothers are supposed to do kind of person. He filled that role. He earned his right to be that older son. And then all of a sudden we have this picture of this older brother who doesn't want to come inside. Is it possible that the older brother is perhaps the focal point of this story? Somebody who thought that they weren't lost is really lost. You ever been lost and you don't know that you're lost? And then when you realize that you're lost, you realize just how incredibly lost you were? I mean, that's often the case, right? When we're lost and we don't know that we're lost, that's when we are really lost. See, we read this story, and my guess is that most of us in this room, I mean, it's possible, but I'm guessing that the large majority of us in this room, we're not going to run out and ruin all of our inheritance money on prostitutes and wildlife. I mean, it's possible. But more than likely, most of us fall into another category. Maybe something like that older brother who's saying to himself, maybe I don't think that I'm lost. Maybe my life, as good or as bad as it might be, is somehow missing out on a life God intended because I didn't know that I was lost. The older brother in this story is that person who's more lost than his younger brother in this story. Perhaps this older brother is more lost than we thought. The older brother has something buried. Has some kind of anger, some bitterness, some rage, or something underneath the surface that's taking him over, and what brings it out? What allows all of that anger and rage to come out? Somebody else's joy. You ever been there? Where somebody else is succeeding, somebody else is getting the promotion, somebody else's lawn is greener than yours, and you just don't know why you fertilize just as much as they do? And you're like, why are they receiving all of these good things? And suddenly all that anger, all of that bitterness just percolates inside of us. So the elder son, he replies to his father, who goes out and says, come in. He says, all these years I've slaved for you, and never once have I refused to do a single thing that you told me to do. In all of that time, you never even gave me a young goat for a feast with my friends. Now, let me just say this. I mean, his dad's never given him a young goat as a feast for his friends, but who would want to have a feast with this guy anyway? He just seems like he's so angry and so bitter. That's an aside. But yet, when this son of yours comes home, you throw a huge barbecue because everyone is invited, and I didn't even know about it. What this older son does is he identifies himself as a slave. He can't even identify this younger brother as my brother. What he simply says is, that son of yours, right? He doesn't say, when my brother did this, when my brother came home. What he says is, that son of yours. It's almost as if he forgets that he's a son altogether. This is the guy who was so wrapped up in the whole situation of having been the right son, having done all the right things, that he doesn't even see that he's lost his own notion of what it means to be a son. Because his picture of what it is to be a son is somebody who has earned the right to be called a son. Those of you that are parents, have your children earned the right to be your children? Has your daughter earned the right to be your daughter? Has your son earned the right to be your son? No, they just are. And they forever will be. But this older son has this impression about what it means to be a son. What he says is, Dad, I slaved, I worked, surely I've earned the status of being your true son. My brother did the opposite. He can't even be the son because he didn't earn it, right? The older brother has forgotten what it means to be a son, and he doesn't want it. He's so lost, he can't even celebrate. And underneath all of this is some sense that I'm going to be forgotten. That I'm going to be neglected or passed over. And I'm afraid if I don't work hard enough, or I do enough stuff to prove that I'm a son, that I won't deserve it. And because that other guy didn't deserve it, he shouldn't be called a son either. So who's this story for? I mean, it raises an interesting question. This story is for people who were critics of Jesus. Chapter 15, verses 1 and 2 say this: the tax collectors and other notorious sinners were coming to listen to Jesus teach. Jesus is having people around him that are unclean, that were dead people, that are just like that younger brother. And this made the Pharisees and the teachers of the religious law complain that he was associating with such sinful people and even eating with them. So Jesus tells 3 stories in a row to explain what he's doing, why he's doing such outrageous stuff. I mean, Jesus is a good rabbi. And a good rabbi shouldn't be hanging out with people like this. And he tells them 3 stories. Let me just give you 3 quick, super quick shot of them. The first one is this, in Luke 15. There was a man who is a shepherd who has 100 sheep. And one of them wanders away. And he says, doesn't the shepherd leave the sheep and go out to find the other one and bring them back home? And once he does come home, doesn't he call up all of his friends and neighbors and say, hey, good news! My sheep that was lost is now found. He says, let's celebrate. Let's throw a party. And then Jesus says this. The same thing happens in heaven when someone turns their life around and comes back home to God. Then he tells the second story. There's an old woman. Now, I don't know if she's old, but I think it's more fun if she's an old woman. There's this old woman. She's in this house. She has 10 coins, and she loses one of the coins, right? She tears the house apart trying to find this one coin. And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors. She sends a text message on her phone and says, come over, we have to celebrate. This is a good thing that I found what was lost. And Jesus says this: the same thing happens in heaven over one sinner who decides to come back and walk with God. Then there's the third story, and it starts like this. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger son asked for his inheritance from his father. Jesus is telling these stories to people who are very much critical of his decision to hang out with people who deserve to be slapped. Remember what we talked about that last week? that literally the younger son, when he comes to his father and says, I want my share of my inheritance, it was prescribed in the Jewish law that it was okay for that father to slap him in the face. And Jesus is hanging out with those kinds of people who deserve to be slapped in the face. Jesus is talking to people who do all the things that they're supposed to do, who show up at church service. Maybe they pray at dinner or at other times in their life. Maybe they even read their Bible once in a while. Maybe they even help old ladies across the street. Have you helped an old lady across the street ever before? None of you. Okay. Jesus is going after all of these people who do all of the right things on the outside, on the exterior. In fact, he's going after people who are really great at keeping all of their secret hypocrisy, all of their secret lives buried underneath, right? And Jesus is telling this story and he's saying, you are missing out on a life of joy. You're missing out on a life of being sons and daughters of a God who has made you. So the older son actually does something that's no different than his younger son. He ends up, this older son, he ends up isolated. He ends up alone. He is by himself and he is critical and he ends up missing out on the party. The party's happening. The whole village is there. All of the land workers are hanging out and there's this one person who is noticeably missing from this homecoming feast, from this barbecue that is thrown. And his father goes out to him and he begs him to come in, and now is the one thing that his father goes out to him and he begs him to come in, and he now is the one thing that was most critical, that he was most critical of. He now is the lost son. See how this changed? The one who never ran away is now the one who is lost and who is separated from his whole family. Verse 31 says this, his father said to him, look, dear son, you've always stayed by me and everything that I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day for your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and now is found. The dad says, everything I have is already yours. In fact, he says everything I have is yours. And if you look at it even more closer, the younger son's portion, right? The younger son's portion of whatever the dad had is already gone. So everything that you can now see is the older son. It is all his. And it always has been. The Father's saying, do you want to come and be a part of a celebration like this? And then the story ends. Verse 32 is the end. The father begs his son, do you want to come in and be part of a party because we're celebrating a resurrection story here. Someone was dead and now they come back to life. Isn't that great news? And then that's it. That's the end of the story. It's almost like roll the credits. We're done. It's almost as if Jesus had something else to do. So the father went out and begged his older son to come into the party, and then Jesus says, I got to go talk to some fishermen. And what he's doing is he's saying, you guys discuss this amongst yourselves. You religious leaders, you notorious sinners and tax collectors, you discuss this now amongst yourselves, what I've laid out to you. He's talking about this and then he's leaving it open for a reason. He's throwing the whole story back to the religious people, those people who were so critical of everybody else, who were bitter that Jesus was spending so much time with people who are in their minds dead and deserved it. He's throwing it back to them. The younger son has come back to life, and they can't find it as a reason to celebrate because there's no forgiveness and there's no joy left in their lives. And Jesus is challenging them. Do you guys want to come to the homecoming party? Do you guys want to come in? Everybody's invited. You can stand out there. You can walk out in the cold. You can wait out in the cold. Or you're invited to celebrate. And if you continue to look at this life and say, people who went from death to life, I don't want to be part of that, then you're missing out on the greatest possible story and the greatest possible party ever. See, the picture we get is a community followers is one in which the worst, the forgotten, the lonely, the least, the wildest, the most dead people get to come back to life. They're the ones that get welcomed home. No one, the Bible seems to be saying, is beyond coming home. So when they do, when new life is found in a life that has been dead for so many years, how do you and I respond? Are we able to celebrate? Or are we ones who create drama? I'm going to close with a word of prayer, and as we do, I just want to ask you, are you the younger son who's running away with wild living? And perhaps you feel like you can't come home. Perhaps you are the older son who's critical of those who try to come home. Maybe you're the one who's missing out on being sons and daughters of God because you haven't earned it yet. Let's pray. God, we have a very clear picture about the joy that is in life being restored to people. We wrestle with the tough things in our own lives that only you know about, how we're feeling and how we're acting. That it might be people who can celebrate, who look at homecoming and say, this is so much fun, I can't wait to be part of the barbecue, part of the party, and the dance and the music. But many of us are wondering what it means to come home. Would you show us the way? Make us, oh God, to live a life of celebration about homecoming